So, Chodesh Tov, everybody. We are on Mem Gimel today. We are going to start 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines from the top of Mem Gimel with the second interpretation of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is telling us that we cannot take a plate and put it under a candle on Shabbat in order to collect the dripping oil. And so the question was, what is the reason behind this? So Rabbah had suggested, and the Gemara began by quoting an analogous circumstance, which was putting the dish under the chicken to receive the egg that falls out of it, right? So in a similar way, so it's connecting these two cases. So Rabbah tried to explain both of these cases by saying the reason is because you cannot carry something, you can't move something on Shabbat unless you're moving it for a permitted purpose. And in this case, by moving something for a thing that itself cannot be moved. In other words, you can't move an item for a muktzeh thing. And since an egg is muktzeh on Shabbat, you can't move a plate to catch it. Since the oil is muktzeh on Shabbat, you can't move the plate in order to catch it. However, all the other cases were cases that are such frequent circumstances, he said, in those situations, the rabbis did not prohibit you from moving a permitted item in order to catch or support or fix a non-permitted item. But in this case, since it's not a common occurrence for oil to leak out of the dish out of the candle, and since it's not a common occurrence for a chicken to lay an egg in a place that it's going to roll and become damaged, so therefore they did not allow you to move the plate in order to catch the egg or to catch the oil. That's what Rabbah said. But now we come to Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef has a totally different interpretation of the halacha, that you're not allowed to catch the egg, and also therefore for the halacha that you can't catch the oil because they're the same. Rav Yosef Amar, Hainu ta'amad Rav Chisda. This is the reason. Mishum dekam mevatel keli mehechano. So this is a different approach. He says it's not because you're moving the plate for a muktzeh item. That's not the reason. The reason is because once the egg falls onto this plate, or once the muktzeh oil falls onto this plate, what you're going to be creating is what's called a basis ledavar asur, which means you're going to be creating a base for a muktzeh thing. And that means, in other words, once the egg falls out of the chicken into this bowl or whatever you put under the chicken, you can't move the bowl now, right? You're not allowed to move the bowl. Once you put a bowl under the candle and it catches oil dripping from the candle, since the oil is itself muktzeh and it falls now into your cup, or bowl, now you can't move that cup. And so Rashi explains what is the problem. He says that the reason is because it's as if a person were to fix it to the ground, because now you can't move it anymore. So it would be as if you welded it to the ground, so to speak, because now you're not allowed to move it, and that's a malacha on Shabbat. Not that this is biblical, but rabbinically speaking, it's almost as if you took this vessel and you attached it to the ground, because now you're not allowed to move the vessel anymore. So
that's why like if you put something muktzah on a table, the whole table becomes muktzah.
That's true,
right? That's the.
And that would be a case of mevatel keli mehechano, which means the item was initially able to be moved, and now you're making it muktzeh, you're making it fixed in place that you're not allowed to move it at all. Okay, so that is the problem according to Rav Yosef, and that's the reason why you can't put a bowl under a chicken to catch an egg. That's why you can't put a bowl under a candle to catch oil, according to Rav Yosef. So now we're going to have to throw a whole bunch of objections at him. So Abai said, we said yesterday the case that you have a barrel of tevel, you have a barrel of produce or wine, oil, whatever it is, that was untithed, and since it was not tithed, that means that you're not allowed to use it on Shabbat. You're not allowed to tithe on Shabbat. You can't separate maaser. You can't separate truma on Shabbat, which means that this oil or wine can't be used, but it's leaking out of the barrel. So the problem is it's muktzeh because you can't use it on Shabbat. You can't eat that tevel on Shabbat because you can't fix it. You can't separate them out. Maaser, so it's muktzeh, and yet you're allowed to come bring a bowl and catch whatever is dripping out of the barrel. So according to Rav Yosef, just like according to Rabbah, we have a problem with this. How can you put a bowl under that barrel that's going to collect that tevel? Because now that bowl that you put there is going to become muktzeh also. And according to Rav Yosef, the whole problem is you can't make a vessel muktzeh on Shabbat. You can't purposely create a situation where it's going to become muktzeh on Shabbat. So therefore, what does he say? He says, I don't buy that. I don't think that tevel is really muktzeh on Shabbat. Why not? Because if someone were to go and separate Maaser, even though you're not allowed to, or if somebody were to go and separate Truma, even though you're not allowed to, it would be effective. So therefore, in potentia, really, that produce could be used on Shabbat, that wine could be used on Shabbat, that oil could be used on Shabbat, in potentia, because somebody could separate the Truma or Maaser, even though they're not allowed to. And therefore, it's not considered Muktzeh, and if it falls into this bowl, it's not going to make the bowl considered Muktzeh either. Okay, so what about the next case? What about the case that said that you can put a plate next to a candle in order to catch sparks? Why can you catch sparks? Amar Ravuna, the son of Rabbi Yoshua, said the answer to that is nitzotzot, sparks don't have any substance. What are you going to say? The sparks are sitting on the plate? No, the sparks fall on the plate. The plate blocked the sparks from hitting the table, but you don't look and see sparks on the plate. There's nothing muktzeh on the plate. What about the fact that you said that you can take, what about the Mishnah that told us that you can take if you see that there's a sagging beam in the roof or something like that, you can take a bench and stick it there and hold the beam. So isn't that the same? Aren't you making the bench now muktzeh? Because now the bench is serving a function as part of the structure of the house. So you're not going to be able to move the bench anymore once you stick it there. Isn't that the same as making something muktzeh on Shabbat? And he answers, no, it's that he placed it, he leaned it against the board, but he didn't fix it in place so that it's really a part of the structure. So he's still allowed to move it. It's that it doesn't become a part of the house because it's still loose. So therefore he's not making it muktzeh on Shabbat. And again, Rav Yosef's argument is that you can't make a vessel muktzeh on Shabbat. That's considered an Isur Midrabanan because you're making it immovable. Okay, it's no longer movable. Okay, now, Notnin Kli Tachat Delef B'Shabbat, we also said that if the roof is leaking, you can put a cup or a bowl under it to catch the delef, to catch the dripping. So how can you do that? Aren't you going, isn't the dripping muktzeh? Now it's water that's unusable. It's not potable water. It's falling into this bowl. Now the bowl is going to be muktzeh. Answer is B'Delef HaRoi. It must be talking about clean water. This is water that you actually would be willing to drink. Whatever's dripping is water that's drinkable water. And therefore it's not going to make the clean muktzeh. Kofin etasal lefnei efrochin. What about the fact that it says Shi'alu v'yerdu? That it says, yeah.
Why it's not muktzeh? Because of the shortage of water?
Because the water is drinkable. If it's potable water that you could drink, then it would be okay. Only if it's dirty water, like sewer water, then it would be muktzeh. You're not allowed to touch it. Now, but it says you can take a basket and turn the basket over in front of chicks. We're not talking about the type of chicks that you're looking for. We're talking about the chickens, little chicks. Okay, so baby chickens. Now, the little chickens that go up and down on top, they like to play in the baskets. Okay, so when they're standing on the basket, animals are muktzeh on Shabbat. That doesn't mean you can't pet a dog. You can pet a dog. A dog can jump on your lap. You can pet a dog, but you can't carry a dog on Shabbat. You can't move a chicken. So if the chick is sitting on top of the basket, so you can't move the basket, it becomes muktzeh. So how can the Mishnah tell you that you can turn a basket over in front of chicks to jump on it if you know when they're on there, they're making it muktzeh? So why would they allow you to do that if according to Rav Yosef you're not allowed to make a kli, you're not allowed to make a vessel muktzeh on Shabbat? So what's the answer? He says that kasavar mutar letaltelo, because he says, Rav Yosef says, actually once the chickens jump off of the basket you can move it again. It doesn't permanently become muktzeh. Ve'atanya, but it says in the Braita asur letaltelo. Why does it say then in the Braita that when there are chicks sitting on the basket you're not allowed to move it? That's because be'odan alav, while they're still standing on it. Ve'atanya afal b'shein odan alav asur. But doesn't it say in the Braita that even if the chicks come off, you still can't move the basket? Amar Rabbi Abahu. Rabbi Abahu says, "Be'odan alav kol ben hashemashot migod it katzaeh." The ben hashemashot it katzaeh lechulei yoma. What it says is that if they were on the basket, all ben hashemashot, in other words, they were sitting on that basket, taking a nap on there or playing on there from the time Shabbat started until nightfall. So then that kli became designated for them for Shabbat. They owned it. Okay, they squatted on it and they owned it during the entire Ben HaShemashot. But if on Shabbat itself, the animal, let's say your dog jumps on a chair on Shabbat, or a cat jumps on a chair, that doesn't make the chair muktzeh for the whole Shabbat. Now we don't say you can't move it for the whole Shabbat, but if that cat is sitting on the chair the entire Ben HaShemashot from sunset until nightfall, he owns the chair. Right. That's it. He made it muktzeh because that's why migod it katzeh Ben HaShemashot, something that's muktzeh during Ben HaShemashot is itkatza'e l'chule yoman. Now it's muktzeh for the whole Shabbat. So if that cat is smart, he says, I don't want anybody sitting on my chair. I'm going to go sit there from candle lighting until after Shabbat dinner. Now you can't move my chair the rest of the Shabbat. That's it. It's my chair.
If you learn Masekhet Shabbat.
If you learn the Masekhet Shabbat, right? Yeah. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak says, Keshem sheno. Okay, so what's the point here? So according Rav Yosef defends himself. His svara is you can't be mevatel keli mehechano. You cannot make a kli. You cannot make an item immovable. You cannot make it muktzeh on Shabbat either because it's considered part of the. It's a derabanan because of stira, because it's like breaking a kli because you can no longer use it, or because it's binyan because actually you're fixing it in place. You're making it immobile. But whatever the case may be, he says you can't do it. Now, we move on. Now remember, Rav Chisda had said, although you cannot receive the egg in a vessel, right? He said you can take a vessel and cover the egg. That's okay. You just can't receive it in a vessel. Now, he says, Rabbi Yitzchak says you can't even cover it. Because according to him, according to Rabbi Yitzchak, under no circumstances can you move something for the sake of a muktzeh item. Since your whole purpose is to protect the muktzeh item, you can't move something. Right, so that's why it's muktzeh. So the egg itself is muktzeh, and the question is, can I move a bowl to cover my egg? The answer is no, because since the egg itself is muktzeh, you can't move something for a muktzeh thing, to protect the muktzeh thing. That's what Rabbi Yitzchak says. Yesterday, Rabbah said you can't. He said the same idea, but he said there's an exception to the rule if it's a common occurrence. Rabbi Yitzchak is saying even if it's a common occurrence, like an egg being laid in a place where people might trample it, you still can't move the bowl to cover it. That's what Rabbi Yitzchak says.
So what's the exception?
He doesn't give an exception. Rabbah had given an exception that if it's a common situation,
then
Rabbah is more lenient. Rabbi Yitzchak is saying absolutely you can never do it.
Right.
So they brought all of these other cases that we've said so far, instead of running us through every single one of these cases, such as the person who moves the bench in order to hold up the board of the house, the person who moves a bowl in order to catch the water that's muktzeh, a person who moves the vessel in order to catch sparks. All of these different cases that we objected to Rabbah, Rabbi Yitzchak is also going to explain them, but he can't explain them the way Rabbah did. Because how did Rabbah explain every case? He said because they were all common cases. We're talking about jugs that frequently break. New earthenware jugs that frequently break. We're talking about a house that was new, so the roof is going to leak because it's a new roof. And in those days, a new roof meant an untested roof, so it was common for it to leak. Nitzotzot, spark coming out of a candle, are very common. So in that, he explained everything as common, because his leniency was common. But Rabbi Yitzchak can't say that, because he holds that even if it's a common occurrence, that's not a justification. So what does Rabbi Yitzchak say? He says, because there's a rule in muktzeh. You can't move a muktzeh item, but if it's tzarich limkomo, if you need the place of the item, you can move it. So let's say, for example, you left your wallet on the Shabbat table, but you need the space on the Shabbat table to eat your food. So you can move the wallet because you need the space. That's tzarich limkomo. So Rabbi Yitzchak will say, why can you move a vessel in order to catch the sparks? That was because that person had to pick up that vessel anyway to take it off the table because it was blocking something, and now he can put it to block the sparks.
But either way, you have to do it b'shinui, right?
Or he had to move the safsal, he had to move the bench to make space for somebody to do something on the floor. But now that he's moving it already, he can put it against the board that's sagging. Or he took a bowl, because he had to move a bowl out of the way. So since he's moving the bowl, now he can put it down where the water is dripping. But he couldn't, in other words, he couldn't pick up the item from the beginning in order to go catch the dripping muktzeh water. He couldn't pick up the item from the beginning to catch the sparks, according to Rabbi Yitzchak. He couldn't pick up the bench from the beginning in order to hold up the sagging roof, or whatever it is, the board, the beam that's sagging. But if he was moving it already because he needed to move it away from somewhere else, once he picks it up, he can put it wherever he wants, right? That's what Rabbi Yitzchak says.
But is he saying, is it mutar?
Yeah, because you already picked it up for some other reason.
Without doing it b'shinui. In other words...
No, because you already picked it up. Once you already picked it up, you can put it down wherever you want.
I see.
Let's say, for example, somebody leaves their wallet on the table, or somebody leaves some other muktzeh thing, and now you have to move it because you're putting the Shabbat food and you forgot your wallet on the table. So you're allowed to move it because it's b'tzarich limkomo. Once you pick it up, you can put it wherever you want. You don't have to drop it on the floor. Once you picked it up already, so put it in a safe place. You understand? So that's what the...
as opposed to what?
As opposed to saying, I can only move it to get it out of the way. I have to knock it on the floor.
Or like hold it for the rest of the Shabbat.
Well, no, everyone knows you wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
But you might think that, if I take let's say there's a muktzeh item on the table, I need to move it. You might think, I can knock it on the floor, but I can't carry it and move it somewhere.
Okay.
So you can. The answer is once you're already picking it up, you can move it wherever you want.
From here to here, if it's wallet, from here to here, no, you can take it completely.
Right, that's what I was asking.
Right, once you're already moving it, move it wherever. So that's what he says. So he says, true, you can't go into the cabinet, take out a bowl to catch the muktzeh water. You wouldn't be able to do that. Because you're moving something to catch a muktzeh thing, you're not allowed to. But if you're moving it already for some other reason, and you just happen to say, I might as well put it down here, that's allowed. Okay? That's how Rabbi Yitzchak resolves it. So Tashma, come and listen to another case. Achat beitza shenolda b'Shabbat v'achat beitza shenolda b'Yom Tov en metaltalin lo lechasot v'et hakeli v'lesmoch b'karei hamita. You can't move an egg that was born on Yom Tov or Shabbat. You can't move it to cover a vessel. Let's say there's something that with an opening and you want to plug the opening by putting an egg over it. Okay? You can't do that because you're not allowed to move it. Everybody goes to great lengths to explain what do they mean support the leg of a bed with an egg. This must be a super strong kind of egg. We don't know. Some kind of special egg. Powerful egg here. But you're allowed to cover it with a vessel so that it doesn't get broken. Right? So you're allowed to cut. The chicken comes in the house and he lays an egg right in the middle of the hallway. So if you leave it there, we know that Davida is going to come and he's going to smash it. We don't want that to happen, right?
Talk about walking on eggs.
Yeah, walking on eggshells.
Sleeping on
walking
eggs.
on eggshells. So right. So what do? You go and you cover it with something. You're allowed to do that. So wait a second. Didn't Rabbi Yitzchak just tell us that you're not allowed to move a vessel for a muktzeh thing? So how can he allow you to take a vessel and cover it? So what's he going to say? Again, b'tzarich limkomo. He says you already needed to move that bowl for something else. You happen to have it in your hand. You saw the egg. So you're allowed to put it down there. That's how we'll explain it. Okay, so now, Tashma, come and listen. Porosin machatzalot al gabe avanim b'Shabbat. It says that you can take mats and cover rocks on Shabbat. In other words, you have rocks, you don't want them to get wet, it's going to rain, or you don't want them to get dirty. So you're allowed to cover them with mats. But rocks are muktzeh. So how can you move the mat in order to cover the rocks? Answer is, what Rabbi Yitzchak will tell you is, ba'avanim mikorzalot dechazan lebet hakisei. These are the rocks that they used to use to wipe themselves in the bathroom. So they were set aside for a Shabbat use. And you're allowed to cover them so they don't get ruined or wet or any other, ruined in any other way. Tashma, come and listen again. It says you can also cover bricks on Shabbat. How can you cover bricks? Bricks are muktzeh. True, the mat is not muktzeh, but how can you move the mat for the sake of the bricks? If the bricks themselves are muktzeh. Answer: the answer is that these were leftover bricks from a construction project, and what would they use them for? They would use them for sitting. They would put them down and they would sit on them. So you're allowed to cover them because they have a Shabbat use. They're not actually muktzeh. They have a purpose on Shabbat. Tashma, come and listen again. It says that you can cover the beehive on Shabbat to protect it from sun when it's hot out, and to protect it from rain when it's raining. So isn't a beehive muktzeh? We would think so, right? As long as you don't have the intention to trap bees. In other words, you can't completely trap the bees inside the beehive, because that's a different malacha tzad. Okay? However, you're allowed to cover it to protect the beehive, but aren't you moving the covering for the sake of a muktzeh thing? Because a honeycomb with all those bees in it, it's muktzeh. So what is the answer? So how is Rabbi Yitzchak going to explain that? Now why didn't they ask this on Rabbah? They didn't ask this on Rabbah because Rabbah will say the reason you're allowed to cover it is because it's a common occurrence that you need to cover it. And he has a leniency for moving something for the sake of a muktzeh item if it's a common occurrence. But Rabbi Yitzchak is not subscribing to that, so we need different answers for him. So what's he going to say? What are we talking about over here? There's honey in the honeycomb, and you can take honey out, so it's not muktzeh. Because if you want to come take some honey out for your food, you're allowed to. Amar le Rav Ukva. Mimeshan Rav Asher, Rav Ukva from Meshan said to Rav Asher, Tenach b'mota chama, de'ika, we turn to Amud Bet, de'ika devash, b'mota gishmim delega devash, ma'ika lememar. That makes sense during the summertime. During the summertime, there's lots of honey in the honeycombs. But during the wintertime, there's no honey in there. So how do you justify covering the beehive on Shabbat if you're not allowed to move something for the sake of a muktzeh item on Shabbat? Answer, he said,
two honeycombs.
Right, exactly. So that's what it says. So lo nitzrachai lelotan shetei chalot. That there are two chalot inside. They would leave two combs of honey inside the honeycomb for the bees to eat. Otherwise, they'll all die over the winter time. So they can't completely eat them out of house and home, so to speak. If they eat every last bit of honey, then these bees are going to die. So they always would leave some honey. So there's still honey in there. But the Gemara asks, "V'hamuktzot ninu." But still, those two honeycombs that you leave, those two combs that you leave inside, those are set aside for the bees to use. So they're also muktzeh. So how is it going to help you? So the answer is, well, they're assuming that it's oozing out. The Mefarshim talk about that. The Mefarshim talk about that. You're not allowed to actually break a honeycomb on Shabbat. Right. So they say that it's oozing out.
You can ask me, I worked to...
You worked on a kibbutz?
2 seasons. No, in school.
Oh, really?
With bee, with parrot, with
wow.
So
nice.
Everything.
Yeah.
So it's oozing out.
2 seasons.
Wow.
But the thing, if it's oozing out, you're not touching the
but they're right. That's okay. But the thing is, what they're trying to deal with is, if this item is totally muktzeh, then how can you even cover it? How can you do anything for it? So it's answering, it's not totally muktzeh because there's a use you can get out of it.
Right.
Okay, so now it says v'hamuktzot ninu, but even those two honeycombs, you're not going to eat them because you don't want to kill the bees. So he says, no, because the chashiv alayhu, because you had intent you were going to take from it on Shabbat. So since you had intent you were going to take from it on Shabbat, it's not muktzeh, and therefore you can cover it. But ha lo chashiv alayhu mai asur. So you're telling me that if you didn't have intent to take from the honey of those honeycombs during the wintertime, because you're leaving it for the bees, then you wouldn't be allowed to cover the honeycomb, the beehive.
Their own honey.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what it's for. We're stealing their food. We're stealing. Yeah. So ihachi haditani ubilvad shleit kaven latzud leflog v'litnei bedida. But according to you, that really what's going on here is that the person had intent to take these two honeycombs. So in the summertime, it's no problem because there's plenty of honey to go around. But in the wintertime, when you're planning to take these two honeycombs, so why doesn't it mention that? So why doesn't it mention that there are two conditions? First of all, the condition is that you had to have intention that you were going to take the honey. And secondly, you have to make sure that you don't intend to trap the bees when you cover the beehive. These are the two conditions. Otherwise, the beehive itself is going to be totally muktzeh. You won't be allowed to cover it. So the answer is that it's telling you two things. True, you have to have had intention to benefit from those honeycombs, and therefore we don't treat the honeycombs as muktzeh because you were thinking you were going to derive benefit from it. The only problem is you also have to additionally not have in mind to trap the bees. Okay, now we say, Mani, who is the author of this then? Rabbi Shimon let le muktzeh. It can't be Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon is so lenient, we say let le muktzeh. He doesn't hold by muktzeh at all, which we're going to see later in the Masekhet is not literally true, but it's pretty much true. He's so lenient that he barely has any categories of muktzeh. He certainly would think that the beehive doesn't need any special intention to make it not muktzeh, because since you could choose to use it. You're choosing to leave it for the bees, but you could choose to use it too, so it's not going to be muktzeh, so this won't even become a question whether you can cover a muktzeh item. It's not going to be a question. Rabbi Yehuda, now if you're going to say it's Rabbi Yehuda who holds of muktzeh, and therefore could say that you shouldn't cover a muktzeh item, you shouldn't even cover a muktzeh item, let's say with a blanket or whatever you're covering it with, but then you're going to have a different problem. What difference does it make whether you intend to trap the bees or not? Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's prohibited to do something even if you don't intend the malacha. So in other words, according to Rabbi Shimon, the case doesn't exist of the beehive, because he's going to say it's not even muktzeh at all. According to Rabbi Yehuda, who's going to say it is muktzeh, and therefore we would have a question, can you cover this muktzeh item on Shabbat? Your answer is going to be a problem. I mean, the Mishnah is going to be a problem for Rabbi Yehuda. Because for Rabbi Yehuda, saying cover the beehive but don't have the intent to trap the bees doesn't make any sense. Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, intention doesn't matter. Right? Because he says, Davar she'eino mitkaven is still asur. Even if you didn't intend to trap the bees, you're trapping them. It doesn't matter. So the answer is, Le'olam Rabbi Yehuda, Umay bilvad shelo yitkaven latzud, shelo ya'asena kimtzuda, Lishbog lehu rabcha, So what does he say? Rabbi Yehuda is not saying. It is Rabbi Yehuda's position. What he's saying is not your personal intention. He doesn't care about your personal intention. What he's saying is do it in a way that it's not trapping them. Because if you completely seal them off by covering the beehive, you're trapping them automatically. So he's saying wrap it in a way that it leaves space. Delishbok lehu ravcha. That's revach. You leave space so that delo lit tzadu memela. So they don't automatically become trapped. Because Rabbi Yehuda will say, if you completely cover the beehive, it doesn't matter that you in your heart weren't thinking that you wanted to trap them. You trapped them. That's it. Right? Yeah, it doesn't matter. So therefore you have to leave it open so that they can escape. That's all that Rabbi Yehuda is saying. So therefore that's who the case follows, Rabbi Yehuda. And it will be muktzeh unless you had in mind that you wanted to partake of those honeycombs during the winter time. And during the summertime, when there's plentiful honey, you don't have to have a special intention. It's not muktzeh at all. Now Rav Ashe says, I reject this whole thing about the 2 honeycombs. Forget that. He says, it never said in this Braita that you're making such a big deal that, what about the winter time when there's no honey? It never said winter time. It never said bimota geshamim in the season, the rainy season. In the rainy season, maybe everybody agrees you can't even cover the honeycomb, because the beehive, because during the winter season there's no honey for people in there. It's only for bees. However, what does it actually say? It says b'chama mipnei chama u'b'gshamim mipnei geshamim. It says when it's sunny or when it's raining. Katane yomed Nisan u'yomed Tishrei de'ika chama v'ika geshamim v'ika dvash. The only time this Braita is talking is during the season, spring and fall, when you have, in other words, from Nisan through Tishrei, where you have sometimes sun, sometimes rain. Not during the dead of winter where there's no honey inside the honeycombs at all. But during this, from the spring through the fall where there's honey in the honeycombs, that's when it's not treated as muktzeh because there's enough honey for people to take. But during the winter, Rav Ashe is saying, during the winter time where the only honey in there is the honey that you left so the bees could make it through the winter, that's definitely muktzeh. That definitely wouldn't be able to, you'd have to treat it as muktzeh. Nobody's going to take from that honey.
Honey that you left for the bees?
Yeah, because the point is you could completely rob them, take all their honey, and then they'll die.
So
instead, they leave them honey.
Put honey and leave
No, they would leave 2 of the combs in there, 2 of the pieces, the chalot, from the honeycomb. They would leave, so the bees can eat that. They eat the honey.
And they stay there throughout winter.
Throughout the winter. So you would leave it for them. Okay. So the whole thing was that those should really be muktzeh because they're not for human use. They're for the bees. So we went through this whole thing. Well, if you intended to use them, maybe the person intended to. Rav Ashe says you don't have to go with that. Forget about intended to use them. We're just talking about a case where there's honey in the honeycombs because it's during the season where there's honey. You don't need to create a case where it's during the winter time and you left those 2 honeycombs, but you had intention. You were going to use them. I mean, you don't need to create a case like that. Just assume we're talking about the season where there's honey in the honeycombs. And that's why the honeycombs are not muktzeh, because you could go in and it's oozing out. You could take it during Shabbat. And since you could take it during Shabbat, it's not muktzeh. And therefore you could cover it on Shabbat if it starts to rain. And that's all. That's what Rav Ashe says to solve the problem. Okay, Amar lahu Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet said to them, Puku ve'imru leila Rabbi Yitzchak. Go to Rabbi Yitzchak and tell him, Kvar tirgema Rav Huna lishma'atich beBavel. That Rav Huna already explained your teaching in Bavel. In other words, what he means is you're teaching that you're not allowed to move anything for the sake of a muktzeh item. Okay? Rav Huna already taught this in Babylonia. How so? Dam Rav Huna, because Rav Huna said, Osin mechitza lamet b'shil chai, then osin mechitza lamet b'shil met. You can make a mechitza, a partition for a dead person for the living, but not for the dead. What does that mean? In other words, let's say a person dies outside, so they want to protect him. They want to put up some walls there. They want to put up a tent over him, but it's Shabbat. What are they going to do? You can't move items to protect the dead person because you're not allowed to move things for the sake of a muktzeh thing, and a dead body is muktzeh. So maihi, what does it mean? Damar Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda v'chein tana shela marei, because Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda said, and so said Shela marei also taught, meta mutal b'chama. If a person dies in the field and they're lying out in the sun, and of course they don't want the body to become putrid, they don't want it to start to decompose in the sun. So, because it's not kavod, it's not for the dead body. So, ba'im shnei bnei adam v'yoshvin b'tzido, two people come and they sit next to the dead body. Cham lahem milmata, it's too hot on the ground for them to sit. So, what do? So they have to come and they bring two couches to sit on, right? Two beds. When it gets too hot above them, they make a makeshift kind of tent over themselves out of a mat that they hang over themselves. So now they're
in between two beds.
Right, in between the two beds. So they're standing out there. And they're sitting on beds now with this sort of makeshift kind of tent over them of the machatzelet.
Do they cover the?
So there, because imagine that this is the dead body. So one guy's sitting here on the bed, one guy's sitting here. Now they've extended a machatzelet.
So that's the way that they're
this rug or this mat over them. So, but it's over them. So in other words, the point is that they're making it over themselves because they're alive. So they're allowed to. So they're doing it in a subterfuge sort of way.
Right.
So that's the way that they're doing it in a roundabout way. So now, and then they decide that, you know what, we want to get up and leave. So one puts his bed, instead of the bed being horizontal, makes it vertical. In other words, he puts it on its side, because that's how they would put them away. The other one stands up, puts his on the side. So what do they make? Two walls, right? Now you have two walls, and you have something over the dead body. So now it's kind of like put in a place of kavod. So you have the machatzelet, you have the mat going over the two beds, and you have the beds standing up. So that way you're bringing protection to the dead body. But you wouldn't have been able to bring the beds out or to bring the mat out explicitly to just create some kind of makeshift tent over the dead body. That you wouldn't be allowed to do. Now, what we have now is, incidentally, this halakha that you can't move something for a muktzeh thing is not brought as the final halakha. Just FYI, you should know. Now, so Itmar we said, so that therefore you made it me'eleha, you made it by itself, so to speak. These partitions are created. So Itmar, we stated, if a dead body is sitting in the sun, Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, you pass it from one bed to the other. In other words, you can't pick up the dead body directly on Shabbat. But what you can do is, if he's lying on a bed of some sort, we assume, so you can take a bed, shift him to another bed, then shift him from that bed to another bed, shift him from that bed to another bed, and move him into a secure location, a better location. Rav Chanina bar Shelemya mishmei de Rav Amar. So Rav Chanina bar Shelemya said in the name of Rav, Meiniach alav kikaro tinoko metaltelo. This is what we said before, right? That what you can, so what you can do is right with David Melech. So what you can do is there's a trick that can be used that if you make a muktzeh thing a vehicle or a basis, a support for a non-muktzeh thing, then you're allowed to use it. Right, so you could put anything onto the dead body. So let's say you put a kikar, you put a loaf of bread on him. So you say, okay, I'm not really carrying him, I'm carrying the loaf of bread. Okay, so it's a way to get around the rules of muktzeh in this way. Or a tinok, it would be hard to put a baby to sit on there, but the idea is the same. In other words, that you're putting something on him that you can move. And that way,
this is the concept works both ways.
Right, it works both ways. It makes it negative and positive. That's right. Right. So kulei al malo plige de share. So I'm sorry, I skipped part. So when you have a loaf of bread or a child available who can enable you to move the body, so kulei al malo plige de share, everybody agrees that you can do that. Okay, that you can put the kikar or the tinok, you can put the loaf of bread or the baby or whatever on. You can put something on the dead body that you can help transport it. But the problem is, can you do the bed method? Because the marsavar tiltul menatzad shemei tiltul or marsavar lo shemei tiltul. In other words, what's the machloket between the first opinion that said Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said that you pass the body from one bed to another, right? You shift it from one bed to another without directly touching it. Indirect carrying. So there's no extra item on the dead body. You're carrying it indirectly by tilting a bed and moving it from one bed to the other. So the question is, are you allowed to do that? Because Rav Chanina bar Shelemya is saying you can't do that method. You have to have some other entity that's justifying the carrying. Okay, so that's the machloket, because one says tiltul min hatzad shemei tiltul, and one says lo shemei tiltul. One says that indirect carrying, like this kind of shifting from one bed to another, where you're not directly moving the body, but you're tilting a bed so that the body moves itself to the bed, and then you do it again and again and again. So there's a machloket, there's an argument whether you're allowed to do that. Lema katanei, maybe we can find a basis for a similar argument in among the Tanaim, because it says if there's a fire in the house, you can't move a dead body that's inside the house, according to the Tanakama. Now we don't follow that as the halacha, but that's what it says. Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish. Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish says, Shamati shematzilin tamet bnei adleka. I heard actually that you do remove the body. How so? Hechidami kikaro tinok. My time at the Tanakama. Ideleka. My time at Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish. So if you have a loaf of bread or something that you can place on the dead body to justify moving it, then for sure you're allowed to move it. But what if you don't? Then there doesn't seem to be any justification. So how can there be a machloket here? In other words, how can we have an argument between the Tana? If there's a loaf of bread that you could put on this dead body or some other way to justify moving it, everyone should agree that you can.
The problem is, if there is a fire, you're not allowed to move a bread because of pikuach nefesh.
Why not?
You're not allowed to go in the fire and
no, you're in the house already. You're in the house already. We're assuming.
Okay,
you're
so
in the house. The fire breaks out. You're not going into. Yeah. So maybe we can explain this machloket here between the Tanakama that says you can't move the body out of the fire and the one that says you can. Maybe we can explain it using the same principle that we introduced before. That one is that they're talking about moving it by shifting it from bed to bed. And one is saying that you're allowed to do that. That's what Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish is saying. And the Tanakama is saying you can't do that. You have to have some item that you're putting on the dead body that justifies carrying it directly. But you can't do this indirect carrying. So the Gemara says, La. Everybody agrees that indirect carrying is still carrying, and that's not a good solution. What's the reason why Rabbi Yehuda allows you to move the dead body? So therefore, what's the real reason why Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish allows you to move the dead body? A very simple reason. Because somebody who has a dead body is going to be very sensitive to that. It's their relative. Okay, it's a member of their family died on Shabbat. They're going to let it go up in flames? They're not going to let it go up in flames, right? So what are they going to do? Instead of moving the dead body, they're going to put out the fire directly, which you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. Okay? So therefore, we're worried that he's going to come to violate Shabbat. Better that he violate Shabbat by moving a muktzeh thing. Moving a dead body is just a rabbinical. It's rabbinic and moving a dead body. Then come to extinguish the fire. And then so then it says Rabbi Yehuda ben Shelah said that Rab Asi said that Rabbi Yochanan said the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda ben Lakish when it comes to a dead body, that one is allowed to move it when there is a dzleka, when there's a fire. Now the Shulchan Aruch brings that if you can do any of these other methods, such as putting the kikar, putting the loaf of bread, doing it indirectly, you should do it indirectly. You shouldn't directly just pick up the body and move it. Try to find a way that minimizes the violation of Shabbat involved. And also when you move it, you have to move it out to a place where you're allowed to carry. Otherwise you're violating Shabbat in a different way by carrying into a public domain on Shabbat. So you have to... The bottom line is you're allowed to move it though away from a fire, because we're worried that if a person sensitive to the body, they're not going to leave it there and let it burn. So that last halacha here is we said that this oil that drips out of a candle on Shabbat, if you put the cup there before Shabbat, which you're allowed to do, still the oil that drips onto it, you're not allowed to benefit from it. Tanu Rabban, the Rabbi said, Motar Hashemen shebaneru shebekara asur, for Rabbi Shimon matir. This is a machloket between the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon, that let's say you have an oil lamp on Shabbat, and in the middle of Shabbat, you lit the candle, but in the middle of Shabbat it goes out. So now you have leftover oil. So the rabbis say that oil you're not allowed to use for the rest of Shabbat. Even if you say, hey, I want a little bit of you used olive oil, then you say, hey, I'm going to take some of that for my salad now, put a little dressing. You can't do that, because since you put that oil to be part of a candle, you said, I'm not going to use it on Shabbat, obviously. Because once you make it part of the candle, it's out of your mind for Shabbat. That's rejecting of that oil for Shabbat. Because you're saying, this is part of the candle, I'm having nothing more to do with it for the rest of Shabbat. Okay, so that's why you're not allowed to now if it goes out, you can't say, oh no, I take that back. I want to use the oil now.
So again, this is another example of something that works both ways, that you're designated.
Yeah, designations work in both ways. Yeah. Rabbi Shimon says, since you knew in the back of your mind that this candle could go out, and since you knew in the back of your mind maybe I'll have another chance to use it, you never really relinquished your right to use it. But the rabbis say lighting a candle is pretty much the biggest sign that you're saying, I don't want anything to do with this item, and I'm setting it aside not for Shabbat use. And that's where we'll conclude. And Bezrat Hashem will start with the new Mishnah tomorrow.